My name is Maria Andrea Triana. I'm an architect coming from Brazil, and I'm spending 1 year of my PhD at Brooks University at the School of Architecture. This is part of a program that we have in Brazil that is called Science Without Borders. That means that we can go abroad 1 year to a university in a place that is going to be important for our research in Brazil. My research in Brazil is about social housing projects and how to make a proposal for an integrated approach of incorporation of energy efficiency measures and low carbon measures through a more holistic point of view, considering sustainability parameters and also climate change, with a view to drawing up guidelines for a national housing program. The idea to coming here is because this is a reference university in that aspect, and working a lot in sustainability aspects and also in carbon emissions and for architecture. So it's a very interesting place to come and do as part of my research. Social housing is a very important sector today in Brazil because of the necessity of the houses that needs to be built for the next years. And the idea is to make the study in looking at these two different climates, Salvador and São Paulo, when we have a big housing deficit, and look at the projects and focusing on energy and how can we improve these projects from a life cycle point of view, and including also future changes that may can occur with the climate.
My name is Ricardo S. Rosa, and I'm a senior lecturer here at the School of Architecture, and I teach on the undergraduate program, primarily focusing on the relationship between design and making, so the conceptualization and the materialization of ideas. My research focuses on the role of the architect in contemporary practices of architecture. What's the role of digital fabrication and the craftsmanship? How do we, as architects, relate to the process of making, particularly in the discussions that involve around form and materiality. And through this process, I'm looking at bamboo from an anthropological point of view, identifying what are the characteristics that give value to bamboo in a particular culture. So I'm therefore looking at Colombia and understanding how, as a society, people relate to bamboo and how bamboo is used in architecture. What are the means and methods in which people are engaging? How are they traditionally looking at bamboo, and how are people, also in the contemporary practice of architecture, specifying it as a material? Then I'm taking bamboo myself in a process of design, investigation and making, and I'm going to use digital tools, contemporary tools of practice, and to see what contribution to knowledge can evolve from that form of inquiry. So I'm in this process as a PhD student, and I hope to contribute well to knowledge.
I'll start with when I was unemployed in the southwest of England, in Somerset. I decided to train as a joiner and worked in a joiner's shop after my training for about a year, which was a very horrible experience. It was a very tough, light manufacturing process, but it was pretty grim. So I decided then that to escape that kind of activity, I'd do a foundation in art and design, which is a general introductory program in the UK to principles of art production. You get to try out all sorts of different techniques and different styles of approach to art, and I was quite successful at that. And in that process, I learned about the sort of history of modern architecture and decided that architecture would be the thing for me. So I studied here at Oxford Brookes for 3 years on an undergraduate architecture program. But I didn't complete that, and I decided to do an architectural studies program instead, which involved 2 dissertations, lots of modules, lots of writing about modern Britain, really. As an upshot, I got a degree in architectural studies, which means nothing to anyone. So it was advised if I wanted to continue in academia, I should do a master's in architectural history, which is what I did at the Bartlett for 2 years part-time, and it's from there that I conducted my PhD at the Bartlett, looking at the reconstruction of the South Bank in the immediate post-war period. And that engaged me in a lot of reading of philosophical material produced by a guy called Henri Lefebvre, who's famous in architecture for his book, The Production of Space. I subsequently worked for about 3 years until his death with Stuart Hall, the cultural theorist, most famous probably for establishing or co-directing the Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Project Studies. And that was quite a transformative experience as well. So I got very fully engaged with the New Left and cultural analysis. So most of my teaching work engaged in postgraduate teaching or PhD supervision is about trying to understand material practices which are extra discursive, we might say. So material practices of making, of producing, and the social relationships which are formed in that process of making as cultural practices, raising questions about how we might interpret that as invested in certain kinds of cultural, social, and political meaning. So that's sort of what I try and teach. My own personal research interests lie in the transformation of architecture in the construction industry in the Second World War, and how fairly prosaic or mundane activities of industrial transformation in the Second World War can help us understand both how the state formed in the immediate post-war period, but also how architecture itself was transformed and became what it was in the Reconstruction period, largely in Britain, but reflecting on processes in North America and across Western Europe as well. So that's really where my research is at the moment. I'm also engaged in a research project to reinvestigate the New Left, as they were called, in the immediate post-war period or mid-20th century period, examining how we could understand what their political project was better by thinking about spatial conditions in which they were operating, but also the kind of spatial possibilities they were opening up by their material practices. So what kind of cultural centres, political centres, what kind of art practices and architectural practices were they informed by and which they contributed to and formed themselves. So that's where I'm at.
My name is Rajat Gupta. I'm a professor of sustainable architecture and climate change in the School of Architecture. I'm also director of the Oxford Institute for Sustainable Development and the Low Carbon Building Research Group in the school. My area of research is on sustainable buildings broadly, but covering carbon mapping, building performance evaluation, and climate change adaptation of buildings and neighborhoods. As the lead in sustainable building in the school, I have been in charge of a number of research projects funded by research councils of UK, the European Commission, World Bank, UN, to name a few funding organizations. My recent project was on low carbon communities. It was a multi-million-pound project looking at how low carbon communities could contribute towards national carbon emission reduction targets, and whether being in low carbon communities leads to improvement in energy behaviors in households. I've also led a project for the Research Council called SNAC, which was looking at suburban neighborhood adaptation for a changing climate. And this was looking at future-proofing suburbs in the UK for overheating, flooding, and storms and extreme weather events using a socio-technical approach. I suppose my main theme running across the broad themes is the socio-technical approach that we adopt. So we tend to combine building science with social science, whether we are looking at building performance evaluation, which is about finding out whether buildings actually perform as intended, because it's now well proven that there is a big performance gap between the design performance and the actual performance. And we are interested in finding out the causes for that gap and how can it be reduced. In terms of my research and teaching interests, I've had broad interests with focus on carbon mapping and looking at performance evaluation of buildings. I've also focused quite a bit on heat pumps, trying to see whether heat pumps itself can be a technology that can cause a step change in the reducing household energy use across the UK. Uh, we've been doing a lot of work in the area of climate change adaptation as well. Apart from the SNAC project, we've worked on live architecture projects, including an eco town which is coming up in Bicester, and that is about 6,000 homes which are zero carbon but also future proofed. So they are intended not to overheat, for instance, in the summer, as the fabric gets airtight through simple measures of ventilation and heavyweight thermal mass and other things. I've been supervising quite a few PhD students in a large number of areas within sustainability. One PhD was on ecotourism in hotels in Cyprus. There was another one which combined energy efficiency with heritage buildings. There's one that has recently completed the PhD on looking at heat pumps in a changing climate. So whether heat pumps could be responsible both for heating and cooling buildings. In fact, currently we are looking for two funded PhD studentships, one of which is looking at performance gap in new housing, and the other one is looking at a Bicester Living Lab. So effectively, the PhD student will find out whether people who live in ecotowns are able to, adopt the one planet community's, principles or not. Now, in terms of the overall research that I've done, the way it fits into the broader context is that we know that climate is changing, and the main cause is carbon emissions that arise from energy use, from burning of fossil fuels. But what's really important to know is that 50% of that energy use happens in buildings because of heating, lighting, cooling. And our research tends to look at how we can reduce that, whether that's through new buildings or advanced low carbon refurbishments, or ways of adapting human behavior, and then how we can adapt the building stock as the climate changes. And our research is not just theoretical. We tend to do very applied research. We've refurbished with architectural practices, houses which have achieved over 80% carbon reductions. We've worked on live architecture projects where we've helped architectural practices adapt buildings for future. We've also looked at heritage buildings and seen how those buildings can be refurbished to reduce energy use by 50% or more. So our area of work tends to answer the main question is, how can buildings become part of the solution in addressing climate change and also adapting for a future climate change.
My name is Marcel Vellinga. I'm the research lead in the School of Architecture here at Oxford Brookes University. We try to be as inclusive as possible in our research in the school, so all staff members teach, but all staff members also engage in research. And in order to facilitate that, we've set up 5 different research groups, each of which with their own emphasis, their own focus of research. So the first group we have is the Architectural Engineering group, which has expertise in the areas of construction, building envelope, and particularly steel. We have the Low Carbon Building group, which looks at issues of carbon counting as well as post-occupancy evaluation. We have the CENDEP, Center for Emergency and Development Practice, which looks at issues of post-disaster housing, humanitarianism and architecture and conflict. We have the Place, Culture and Identity group, which is a group that looks at the architectural humanity sides of architecture, urban conservation and management, vernacular architecture, architectural history, etc. And then finally we have the Design Theory and Practice group, which is made up of the designers in the school who engage in research through design. All of these groups have a number of staff members associated with them, and all of these groups also have a group of PhD students related to them, and they all engage in different activities projects, seminars, publications, etc. I'm not an architect by training, I'm a cultural anthropologist. I've got my PhD from Leiden University in the Netherlands. But my research has always, from the beginning, really been focused on architecture, in particularly traditional architecture, or indigenous vernacular architecture as it is called, of the world, really. My PhD focused on the architecture of the Minangkabau people in Western Sumatra and Indonesia in particular. And after I finished my PhD, I came here to Oxford Brookes to work as an assistant initially to Professor Paul Oliver here in the school. And then I kind of stayed on and developed my own research over the years. My research interests are varied, but I think mainly focused on vernacular architecture, but in a more broader sense on the anthropology of architecture, which of course includes a lot more forms of architecture than just vernacular architecture. But my earliest research focused on Minangkabau architecture in Indonesia. And because of that, I suppose I ended up in the more vernacular architecture field, the architecture of the people, or the architecture of specific cultural groups around the world, the architecture of the everyday. So from an anthropological perspective, I look at not just the buildings and the materials and the technologies, etc., and the forms, although this comes in, but I'm mainly concerned with the cultural meaning of the architecture and the reason as to why people build certain buildings in certain ways, as to why they use space in a particular way, etc. And I try to relate all that to people's beliefs, values, needs, etc. I teach on the IART program, the Master's Program in International Architectural Regeneration and Development, and I also engage in PhD supervision. Most of those PhD students have focused on vernacular architecture. Quite a few have focused on other elements of architecture as well. Always, I suppose, the emphasis is on an ethnographic approach to architecture, a more anthropological view, looking at architecture in its broader cultural and social context. So I've had students working in Cyprus, in Thailand, in Ireland, in different parts of the world. I'm currently supervising 7 students. Again, they are quite from a variety of disciplinary backgrounds. In fact, I've got archaeologists and geographers as well as architects. And again, they work in different parts of the world. The essence of my research, I suppose, is, as I mentioned already, it's focused on why people build architecture in a particular way. What is the meaning of that architecture? How does it reflect their values, their needs, etc. And so I've been interested initially, particularly in that aspect in Indonesia or Southeast Asian cultures. But since arriving at Oxford Brookes, my scope of research has widened significantly to the extent that I now kind of look at these types of issues all across the world, really. I currently started editing the 2nd edition of the Encyclopedia of Vernacular Architecture of the World, which is a global overview of traditional forms of architecture. And so I kind of have a global perspective, but I do try to maintain my own more regional interest as well in Southeast Asia and a few other parts of the world. My most recent research is concerned with the German architect Erwin Gutkind, who many people will not know, who's a modernist architect who lived in the early half of the 20th century, and whose work in fact has been very influential in establishing the field of vernacular architecture. So that project is part of a broader piece of research that I'm developing, which deals with the history of vernacular architecture, and particularly the history of the study of vernacular architecture, which I think is very important and an interesting part of architectural history.
The main aim of the research is to investigate the perception of space and place by Palestinians after more than 50 years of increasing presence of architecture of occupation. Taking this as background, the research will focus on its influence on the occupied population's perception of its own environment. And the research will then expand its focus by analyzing the way in which Palestinians are influenced or forced to adapt when shaping their own spaces. In 1967, Israel adopted in the occupied Palestinian territories a permanent emergency state, indefinitely suspending the law without abrogating it. Urban and territorial planning constitutes the main instrument of a complex mechanism of control, normally referred to as architecture of occupation. This is an intricate system of different elements, such as checkpoints, walls, roadblocks, and settlements, and it produces territorial and social fragmentation among the occupied population. The 1993 Oslo Agreement further divided the territory into three different geopolitical zones, A, B, and C, under increasing levels of Israeli military control. The concepts of state of exception and of camp could be some possible interpretive keys. The parallel with the Bantustans of South African apartheid system may come as immediate. Ethnographers of prisons have defined these elements of spatial control as carceral society, as found elsewhere in Iraq, in Morocco, Spain, Cyprus, Tibet. And in the West Bank, these elements become a system defined through the manners of a continuous military occupation. The first case study is the village of Wadi Rahal near Bethlehem, and the second one is the neighborhood of Tel Rumeida in the city of Hebron. And in these two case studies, the researcher have applied the data collection methodology of qualitative data. Therefore, realizing interviews to the inhabitants and especially focus groups, trying to understand the people perception of their own built environment and their view on their contemporary placemaking. The findings of the research are expected to contribute to the definition of elements of the Israeli territorial policy and their effects on the Palestinian perception of architecture and space. Moreover, the Palestinian places will be studied as complexities, whose identity is not totally determined by the Israeli occupation, but also by the surviving vernacular tradition. In the potential prospect of a multiplication of military-occupied lands, following international security protocols, the results could become tools for decision-makers on the fragile political equilibrium of Palestine in premise and of all contemporary contested territories.
My background, I'm Mina Samagui. My background is in architecture. I studied architecture back in 2003 was my undergraduate, and then did a postgraduate and a master's, and now I'm doing a PhD here. As my research is looking at growing edible plants on buildings, and this research question specifically is what are the aspects that affect the behaviour of growing edible plants on buildings. So there's a social focus, looking at people and how they interact with these kind of systems on buildings, and what the factors that are there. And I do a lot of teaching here at the School of Architecture as well, for different modules for the Masters in Sustainable Building, and also some design tutorial work. And the main essence of my research is people, and it almost is going into psychology a little bit, the importance of why people make decisions and why they have certain habits and why they do certain things the way they do. Thank you for listening.
My name is Salam Al-Qudwa. I'm a full-time PhD by design research student at the School of Architecture in Oxford University. This is my first semester over here after my arrival from the Gaza Strip in Palestine. My past experience for the last 11 years is a mixture of practical qualifications and practicing architecture, and teaching architecture at the School of Architecture over there at the Islamic University in Palestine. My qualifications is a mix of architecture practice and tutoring and teaching essential and fundamental subjects to architecture students over there in Palestine. So I prefer to do this kind of research by design, which allow me to use my abilities and practical experience. I work with 2 international NGOs as emergency architect, working with rural and marginalized area in Palestine, and at the same time I was transferring this kind of knowledge to my students, teaching them the fundamental subjects such as freehand drawing and sketching, visual training, advanced design studios, and landscape architecture. Upon my arrival over here in Oxford Brookes, I tried to engage within so many activities and research activities, and one of them is the student research conference, which happened last week with presentations and posters, and really it gives a lot of chances to people over here to participate within the research. The essence of my research, or the title of my research, is about the architecture of every day as a responsible possibility in the Gaza Strip, Palestine, and I built that on my master and previous practical experience working in Gaza for the last 7 or 8 years in poor and marginalized area. Searching for possibilities for Gaza is the main thing, questioning what's the social responsibility of the architects living and working in such context of post-conflict and unstable situation, questioning how we could employ and how we could engage communities into design by participation. So hopefully by the end of this research question I'll be able to answer some of my concerns and to give good work to my people. Thank you.
I'm Jane Anderson. I'm the Programme Lead for Undergraduate Architecture here at the School of Architecture. My teaching is primarily undergraduate teaching in the design studio, and I run the Year 1 architecture studio. My research interests are primarily about live projects. I'm interested in them for probably 2 main reasons. The first is the effect that they have for students, so pedagogically, the things that they can create and the positive effect that it has on their learning and the potential that it has to change architectural education and the way that we think about architecture and what we think is possible as architects. And then a secondary element of that is what happens when you collaborate with outside agencies, and then all of a sudden other projects, other research interests emerge. So for example, our work with an archaeological community group led to a collaboration about material culture. So not only the live projects tend to spark other research interests other than the main pedagogical research interest that I have. I also run the Live Projects Network, which is an online resource for other people who are interested in live projects, and that's an international resource, so that's allowed me to get in touch with other live project educators around the world with similar interests and collaborate with them too.
Hello, my name is Dimitrios Mitratsis, and I'm a 3rd-year student at the School of Architecture at Oxford Brookes University. I'm a structural engineer, and before the start of my PhD, I worked for 3 years in the industry, involved into building design and also research and design within the construction technology sector, and particularly steel construction. I started my PhD in June 2012, and my topic involves improved efficiency of single-story industrial buildings using composite panels. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my research. The title of my research is Improved Structural Cost and Embodied Carbon Efficiency of Single-Story Industrial Buildings Using Sandwich Panels. The project is funded by both government and industry funds, and I'm going to give you a little bit about the background. So the United Kingdom is committed to a reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2020 against the 1990 levels. In order for these climate change targets to be realized, the trend of the building regulations has been to specify increasingly high insulation within the building envelope. This leads inevitably to more embodied carbon within the building because of more material within the envelope itself. The structural capability, though, which arises by this increased insulation is not fully exploited. The structural engineers have been ignoring this extra structural capability that is apparent in building envelope systems, and this has led to over-specification of structures. This is particularly true for sandwich panel systems, which comprise insulation which is bonded at sandwich to metal skins. The research has shown that by re-engineering the structural frame and taking into account the long-span capability and stiffness of cladding systems can result to savings of the structural frame up to 60% in terms of material in terms of mass. This leads inevitably to cost and embodied carbon savings for the whole building. And the research itself represents a significant step towards optimizing the building structures by taking into account the inherent structural capability of the building envelope.
My name is Deniz İkiz. I'm a final year full-time PhD student and an associate lecturer in the School of Architecture. My doctoral research basically focuses on historic urban areas in global cities that are inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. It is supervised by Aylin Orbaşlı and Marcel Velinga. It aims to understand and explain the management complexities of global heritage cities within the context of global development pressures, insufficient policies, and diverse roles of stakeholders, and to assess their existing management structures based on their ways of coping with these challenges. For this purpose, I employed a multiple case study and examined 3 large-scale urban development projects undertaken within the World Heritage Sites in the global cities of Mexico City, Istanbul, and Paris. This research intends to make an original contribution to literature by introducing the size, scope, and complexities of global cities to the fields of heritage conservation and management. In this way, the urban studies on globalization are integrated with the historic conservation approaches. It is also the first study where the management practices of the selected World Heritage cities are assessed for the first time. In addition to my doctoral research, I have been an associate lecturer in the school for the past 2 years. I have supervised several undergraduate dissertations focusing on urban regeneration, architectural conservation, and vernacular architecture. I have also delivered numerous lectures to undergraduate and MA students on the topics of architectural conservation along with history and theory.
My name is Sajjad Tajdaran, PhD student at Postgraduate University. I'm doing my PhD in the School of Architecture. Actually, my background is in mechanical engineering. I've done my master in energy conversion. My master was about improving the thermal efficiency of heat exchangers, technically about turbulent flow and nanoparticles in heat exchanger and how can they affect the thermal efficiency of the system. I'm here in our School of Architecture because my field now and what I'm researching on is about transport soil collectors. They have quite a lot of stuff about mechanical engineering. They have jet flows, they have heat transfer, turbulent flow, and that's why I'm here. I'm here to investigate and improve this system to somehow cut greenhouse. As a mechanical engineer, my research interest is in heat transfer and boundary layer and jet flows and turbulent flow. And what I'm doing in the School of Architecture is quite relevant about transport solar collectors. They have turbulent flow in it, they have heat transfer. I'm doing my thesis about improving the thermal efficiency in these solar collectors, which is relevant to turbulent flow and boundary layers. And I'm doing a numerical model the system, and I'm trying to improve this turbulent flow to affect the heat transfer of the system. The sense of my research is about numerical modeling, and we are about to take a very big experimental model to a computer. I'm really happy I'm here because I have a good support here. We have this experimental thing here, and we have cluster for numerical modeling here, and we're about to do a very big job in Postgraduate University.
Hello, my name is Paolo Sassi. I'm a senior lecturer here at Oxford Brookes. I lead this MSc in Sustainable building performance and design. And I'm an architect, and a lot of my research is related to my practice experience or has been derived from my practice experience. I also supervise a number of students who are also linked to the areas of research that I am undertaking myself. And these are primarily in two strands. One is a very sort of building-orientated areas of research, which is derived directly from my architectural work. And that is a question about how to create very well-insulated, healthy buildings that do not require mechanical ventilation in the mild maritime climate of the south of the UK. So at the moment, this area of research involves me monitoring a number of buildings that are super insulated in the south area of the UK, looking at indoor air quality, temperature, comfort experienced by the occupants, and so forth. The idea is to create some knowledge that will help people design buildings without mechanical ventilation, which can be expensive, require maintenance, and all sorts of other potential user interface problems, while still maintaining very healthy environments which are very energy efficient. So that is one area that I'm looking at, and the other area is a much more socioeconomic side of sustainable design. Following on from doing a very large survey of sustainable buildings, I realized we are not doing much sustainability really. And the question is, why? So my second area of research is really looking at the motivation for designing sustainable buildings and living sustainably. And I've looked at a number of communities and individuals that live in sustainable homes or live sustainably. And I'm trying to establish why and how they got there and what motivated them and what were the problems and what made it easy. And ultimately, I'm looking at what aspects of sustainable buildings are attractive to people and will essentially make people go down that route, regardless whether they're interested or not in that field.
Eileen Arbashle. Much of my research is in some way connected to the concept of architectural regeneration. This spans research into the evolving and expanding theory of conservation, urban conservation, and the ways in which historic buildings evolve within this context. This research has led to a number of recent papers on conservation theory and how authenticity is evaluated in the practice context. Architectural regeneration forms the core of my teaching in the School of Architecture and explores how buildings can be reused, regenerated and adapted to uses in ways that make a positive contribution to an urban or rural place and most importantly to its community. I supervise a number of PhDs in this subject, including a study into decision-making processes that inform the adaptation of school buildings in Portugal and the sustainable adaptation of historic buildings in a World Heritage Site. The management of heritage sites, from archaeological to urban, is another aspect of my research, especially with an emphasis on tourism. It is often the presence of tourism that informs how historic places are conserved, presented and managed. Approaches to the management of the historic environment in the Mediterranean region is research that we've been conducting at Brookes for over 10 years now, and it's an area where we're gaining recognition in terms of impact. PhD research in the area ranges from a study of ecotourism at historical rural settlements in Cyprus, Turkey and Greece, to the complexity of management practices at World Heritage Sites located in major urban conurbations.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Abulamo. I'm Program Lead, Postgraduate Architecture at Oxford Brookes University. And I'm going to kind of talk to you a little bit about my experience, my teaching and research interest in some of the areas that I'm very interested in this point in time. I'm presently, I kind of have different roles in teaching across the school. Last year I was running one of the design units and hopefully we'll run another unit next year. Last year our studio agenda was really commonality and looked at larger interest in infrastructure area and about establishing community and about taking very relevant issues within the agenda of architecture. So we were looking at things anywhere from mental health issues, issues about multiculturalism that began to kind of regenerate new forms of spatial ideas, to human rights issues. And that's sort of the area that I'm very interested in doing right now. When I started my PhD, I kind of moved away from purely instrumentation or digital or craft, and went back to my home roots, which are in Chicago, and tried to work with the history of Chicago relative to how architecture and planning begins to kind of compromise or create levels of social injustice in terms of its ability to empower or depower certain areas of authority and control that it's doing. So I hope in the next year to kind of continue and perhaps finish my PhD. My PhD is specifically on Chicago, but also to go back to my roots in terms of pushing advanced fabrication and advanced simulation of data systems to develop that knowledge within the school, particularly around the issues of sustainability and environmental aspects. The climate change paradigms are going to kind of, after the Paris conference in December, will begin to shift a different focus of the need to address environmental issues in a much stronger capacity. And I think we within the School of Architecture have a responsibility to help bring those agendas within all areas of teaching, not necessarily through green architecture, but the issues about social injustice and the ability of the reason that climate change is creating a separation of a level of inequality across all systems. So, thanks.
Hello, my name's Charles Parrack and I'm part of the Centre for Development and Emergency Practice. And within this centre we do two things. We look at development, which is long-term chronic poverty, long-term problems, and also emergencies, short-term immediate events such as conflict or earthquakes or other disasters. And we're very close to practice as well. The practice part of CENDEP is very important to us in terms of being very close to practitioners and wanting to engage with practice and develop research in this area. And one of the things that I'm very involved in is building up networks with practitioners so that the work that they're doing in the field is able to be looked at, analysed, that we can work with them to gather data and to look at that data and to be able to make sure that then that is part of a research agenda that we can take forward, and we know then that that research agenda has impact because it will be fed back into the work of the practitioners and tools can be developed or other ways of measuring impact can be developed alongside the practitioners. So a little bit about me. I started off as an engineer working in the private sector and then got further involved with architecture teaching, and so I took my technical expertise and brought it into schools of architecture. I then developed a practice in community design, working with communities to help them evolve ways of dealing with their environment and their the places in which they live. And then subsequent to that, I took a master's course in development practice and got involved in post-disaster reconstruction, and that's where the heart of my research is at the moment. I am part of the School of Architecture at Brookes. I have two roles in that school. The first role is as head of technology, so I lead technology across the school, setting the agenda for technology teaching in environment and structures and construction. And then the second part of my work at Brookes is with the Centre for Development in Emergency Practice, and we run a postgraduate course in shelter after disaster, which was the first one in the UK, and this focuses on the shelter aspect of post-disaster reconstruction. My research interests are in the shelter area, and so we have partnerships with different agencies in order to try to develop research together, and we combine our efforts to bid for money and to present those findings in groups who are talking about shelter after disaster or reconstruction communities of practice. The essence of my research, there are three areas of research that I'm interested in and am working on at the moment. The first is research with the camp management cluster of the UN, and this group exists to manage camps well. When refugees move, or when people move within a country as a result of conflict or emergency, sometimes they're in camps, and those camps are almost instant cities, and one of the things that I'm very interested in is how the spaces within those cities work, spaces of transportation, spaces of socializing, so looking at these camps in a way like cities. The second area is building for safety. One of the things that is most important to us about shelter after disaster is that people should build back safer or build back better. So how can we take messages about safer building and make sure they are embedded in the population when they rebuild their houses? And it can be at a very community level, or it could be at a government level dealing with building regulations. And the third part of my research is looking at impacts. How do we know what works well? So measuring impacts of shelter. How do we know what's best in any situation to be able to recommend in terms of the rebuilding strategy? It could be rental strategies, it could be camps, it could be new buildings, it could be repairing old buildings. How do we figure out what works well? And the approach that we're taking is to look at certain responses which were done some time ago, so longitudinal studies 20, 30 years ago, to be able to see what the long-term effects of those are. That's me, that's my research. Thank you very much for listening.